Hey, Bio30s, and welcome to our discussion today about the female reproductive system. Last day we talked about the male's reproductive system, how the sperm are produced in the testes, are then maturing in the epididymis, travel through the vas deferens, head to the ejaculatory duct where they mix with secretions from the seminal vesicles, the Cowper's gland, and the prostate, and are then ejaculated out of the end of the penis and then are basically placed into the female's reproductive system. Today's discussion, we're going to discuss, the path of the sperm travel once they enter the female's reproductive system. So, whereas in the males, we sort of went from the gonad to the outside, in this case, our discussion will be going from the outside toward the gonads, and that'll be the way we will discuss the anatomy in today's lesson. The outer portion of the female's genitals are referred to collectively as the vulva. There is a few portions that are, to be noted. There are two sections called the labia majora and the labia minora. The majora is an outer fold of skin that sort of surrounds the vaginal opening, and then right along the edge of the vaginal opening, you're going to have the inner fold of skin or tissue, which is going to be known as the labia minora. As well, in this location, located directly inside the labia minora, is going to be the glans clitoris, which is analogous to the glans penis in the male. And then you're also going to find a gland known as the Bartholin's gland, which is analogous to the male's Cowper or bulbourethral gland. And it basically provides secretions during intercourse to basically ease, penetration of the penis into the vagina. Once you get inside of the female's reproductive system, you enter the first spot would be the vagina, which basically serves three roles actually. It serves as a conduit for the erect penis to be placed inside during intercourse, as well as the entry point for sperm into the female, into her reproductive system, and it also serves as the birth canal during birth. At the end of the vagina, you're going to find a small opening known as the cervix. The cervix is basically a passageway that connects the vagina to the uterus. And this is a site of one of the leading types of cancer in women. Right after lung and breast cancer, the third leading cause of cancer in women is cervical cancer. We've talked about how certain viruses can become mutagens that can cause cancer. Well, this is where HPV kicks in. Women are recommended to get vaccinated from HPV, and the reason is if you do become infected with HPV, this is one of the sites of the cancer that can be caused by exposure to an infection with HPV, and it can be with all cancers. Again, early detection is important. In order to get a sense if there's any cancerous cells in the cervix, this would be you would collect a swab of these cervical cells, which is known as a Pap test. So if you've heard of a Pap test, that's what a Pap test is, basically to collect epithelial cells on the cervix to determine whether or not they're cancerous or not. Which then leads us into probably the largest, organ or largest structure in the female's reproductive system, which is the uterus. The uterus is basically designed to hold and nourish the developing embryo and then obviously fetus until it's carried to term over a period of 9 months. It's comprised of 3 layers. The outermost layer is known as the perimetrium. It's basically the outer connective tissue that sort of hold the uterus together. The middle layer is known as the myometrium. Anytime you hear the word myo, like we talked about in bio 20, myo refers to muscle, and the myometrium is the middle muscular layer that basically causes contractions of the uterus during birth. So when you deal with contractions during labor, this is where those contractions are being generated from the myometrium. And technically, it is considered, well, it is. It's smooth muscle. The innermost layer is the one you should be most familiar with. It's called the endometrium. This is the layer that's shed once a month during menstruation, and we'll be discussing the endometrium. Probably more than the other 2 layers combined. We'll be discussing it throughout today's discussion for sure. So the endometrium, innermost layer, that's the material that's expelled once a month during menstruation. All right, and then I'm going to do these ones out of order, but if a sperm was entering a female through an intercourse, it would obviously enter through the vagina, through the cervix, into the uterus. It would then wind up in its final destinational area, which is the oviduct. There are two oviducts that extend off of each side of the uterus. Each one is leading toward one of the female's ovaries. The oviduct connects the uterus to the ovaries, and it is the site of fertilization. This is where the sperm and the egg are presumably going to meet up if there is a fertilization event. And then obviously at the end of the oviducts, and I'll be discussing them right away because here's our diagram of it, we get to the final structure. The sperm never make it this far because it's basically where the gametes are produced. This would be the ovary, and the ovary obviously are where the eggs are being produced and then released, which I'll be discussing for quite a bit here of today's lesson. So again, the ovary is basically going to produce gametes. The female egg is known as an ova, plural, ovum, singular. That isn't what is released by the ovary. The ova or the ovum only forms after a sperm comes in contact with the egg. Technically speaking, the ovary releases a secondary oocyte, which we'll get to here in a couple seconds. We talked about oogenesis earlier in the course in cell division. I will quickly run through the process of oogenesis again here, but remember that an oogonium, primordial diploid cell, an oogonium undergoes mitosis, then it becomes a primary oocyte. That primary oocyte will then undergo meiosis 1 to become the secondary oocyte. That's the actual gamete that gets released from the ovary during ovulation. And then if that secondary oocyte comes in contact with a sperm, it will then, once it fuses with the sperm, just before the genetic material fuses between the two gametes, the secondary oocyte will quickly undergo meiosis 2 to become an ootid, and then will quickly mature into an ovum. And then at that point, the ovum and the sperm's genetic material will fuse to then form the zygote. So just to clarify, the ovary does produce ovum or ova, but they only become ovum or an ovum, singular, if it gets fertilized or it gets in contact with an egg, with a sperm. The sperm basically will quickly cause a chain reaction of events, which will lead to meiosis 2, and then the maturation of the egg into an ovum, and then and only then will the zygote, the diploid zygote, form at the end of that process. When an ovary does, though, produce a gamete, and it wants to release that gamete, and these gametes get released in a female once a month. Males are producing their gametes all the time, billions and billions of sperms all the time. Women are generally producing one egg a month, one gamete a month. Before the release of this egg, the ovary will produce a series of cells that will it almost becomes a scaffolding for the developing gamete. That series of cells that surrounds the developing gamete or the developing egg in the ovary is known as a follicle. So, and you may already know from the male side of things, we talked about a hormone that is going to be very much related to that, which was called follicle stimulating hormone. So we will get to all of that here today. On this page here, I've given you a recap of oogenesis. We talked about it again, and I just mentioned it today, but we talked about it in the cell division unit. Remember that unlike in males, oogenesis is an uneven process. You're basically trying to create one large egg. So you're not looking at 4 equal sperm cells. Like in a male, you get one spermatogonium that then divides and eventually becomes 4 relatively equally sized spermatids. In the case of a female, that one oogonium is then going to divide into 4 cells. But one of them will be the large, which will eventually become the large ootid, which will then, of course, form into the ovum. The other 3 cells that are produced as a part of the process are sort of wasted. They're like just sort of kind of remnant cells that are referred to as polar bodies. So remember, one oogonium is eventually only going to lead to the production of one viable egg. And in a female, this process is all about quality as opposed to quantity. Males are about quality versus quantity. Women are about quality over quantity. And the egg itself is one of the largest cells that's produced in the human body. In fact, an egg cell, a human egg cell, is actually visible with the naked eye. The analogy would be this: if a sperm cell was the size of a human, the egg would be roughly the size of a 30 to 35 story skyscraper in downtown Edmonton. So that's the difference in size between these cells. So you can see why there's this uneven division that's occurring during oogenesis, because we want to give most of the material to that one developing, which will eventually become the full-fledged ootid, if in fact it comes in contact with a sperm. This development, and again the development of the gamete, is going to occur. And the release of this egg is going to become part of what's known as the menstrual cycle, the 28-day cycle that basically governs, women's, physiology once a month, every month that they're reproductively viable, from the time they reach puberty to the time they hit menopause, when the menstrual cycle pretty much shuts down at some point in their, generally speaking, later 40s to sometime in their 50s. It varies from woman to woman. But we will discuss that a little bit later in today's discussion as well. In North America, puberty tends to hit anywhere between as early as age 9 to generally around age 13. Basically when this occurs, we get our hormonal cascade, like I talked about last day in the male's reproductive system. We are going to release, the hypothalamus will begin releasing GnRH. That will stimulate the anterior pituitary gland to then release hormones FSH and LH. In women, these hormones will cause the ovaries these will cause the ovaries to then release hormones of their own, and the ovaries are going to release estrogen and progesterone. Now, I am going to get to the whole kind of how all the hormones work in a few minutes, but again, that's the basic cascade. Is the hypothalamus will release GnRH, the armpit will release FSH and LH, and then the ovaries will then release estrogen and progesterone, which will both have a negative impact on the release of GnRH, FSH, and LH, as we've discussed before. If you're not sure about the cascade, you can go back to the male reproductive system video if you want to quickly look at it right here. There was I drew a diagram of it on the board as it related to males. But just replace in the male, there was the release of inhibin and the release of the release of testosterone. In the case of a female, though, we're dealing now with the release of progesterone and estrogen from the ovary, which then have the negative impact on the release of GnRH and FSH and LH. Okay, so this whole menstrual cycle is basically two cycles. There's the first cycle, which we'll discuss, is the ovarian cycle, which basically dominates the ovary, and at the same time, during the same time frame, days 1 to 28, the uterus will have a cycle of its own called the uterine cycle. So there's two cycles that are sort of at play when we're dealing with a female's menstrual cycle. It's being governed by both the ovaries and the uterus combined. So just to kind of clarify that right there. Let's take a look at the ovarian cycle first. The ovarian cycle, and is basically broken into three stages. The ovarian cycle starts, so day one of the cycle, just so you know what counts as day one, and I haven't discussed the uterine cycle, but I will in a few minutes. The uterine cycle, day one is when menstruation begins. So when a female begins to menstruate, that's essentially day one of the menstrual cycle. So when I'm dealing with day one in the ovary, you can basically know that on day one in the uterus, menstruation is beginning at that point. So in the ovary, the first phase is called the follicular phase, which is going to basically see the development of that follicle that I talked about around the developing gamete that's occurring inside the ovary. This occurs for roughly 13 to 14 days. Days 1 to 13 are basically considered the follicular phase. Now, this stage is dominated by two hormones. It's initially dominated by FSH, follicle stimulating hormone, which makes sense. It's the follicular phase, so we would want a follicle stimulating hormone to be kind of the one that triggers the start of that phase. And because FSH is going to be released, we're also going to see a bit of a spike in estrogen as well. But the process by which this phase starts in a female is generated by the release initially of FSH coming from the anterior pituitary gland. During this stage, you're going to see basically meiosis 1 occur. You're going to see these primary oocytes, and if you remember back to cell division, these primary oocytes were pretty much already developed inside the female when they were basically an embryo or a fetus in their mother. So these eggs had been lying dormant since basically very early into the development of that female. They basically arrest at prophase in meiosis 1. So they've been sort of in an arrested development at that stage of division. Now the rest of the division of meiosis 1 can occur. Now we can go to metaphase, anaphase, and telophase 1. And basically by the end of the 13 days, we've created this secondary oocyte that's basically surrounded by this group of cells called the follicle. And you can see it sort of here in the diagram. There's some information there showing you sort of the development of the gamete that's occurring during this time. Once the gamete has formed, once the follicle is fully developed around the gamete and the secondary oocyte is ready to be released, what we're going to see then is we're going to see two hormones spike at that point. LH is dominant at this point. LH is going to spike very heavily, and I'm going to discuss all that down here on this graph in a couple seconds. So if you're not sure why I'm saying it's spiking and all that, I'm going to discuss all that here at the bottom when I get to the bottom of this page. But LH is basically spiking hard, and FSH spikes a little bit as well. And the spikes of both of those hormones on roughly day 14 is going to cause the release of the secondary oocyte, the egg, which is known as ovulation. Now, ovulation, basically, it's going to erupt out of the side of the ovary. Now, the ovary, I'd mentioned earlier, was sort of connected to the oviducts because that's where fertilization occurs. But it's interesting to note that when the eggs are released initially from the ovary, they don't get released directly into the oviduct. They actually get released into the body cavity. And then there's these little kind of feather-like or finger-like structures that are on the ends of the oviducts that are sort of wrapped around the ovary. Would be like, here's my fist would be the ovary, and then this would be, let's say, my arm would be the oviduct. So they erupt into the actual body cavity. And then there's these finger-like projections on the end of the oviduct that actually kind of sweep the egg down into the oviduct. And then, so rather than the egg being released into the body cavity, it does get released into the body cavity, but then it doesn't stay there for long. These finger-like projections known as Fimbriae, they're the ones that actually draw the egg into the oviduct, which is the correct path for it. And hopefully once it gets into the oviduct, there are some waiting sperm there for it, which would then allow that secondary oocyte to then complete or undergo meiosis 2, which would lead to the ootid forming. The ootid would quickly form into an ovum, and then very quickly after that, fertilization occurs, and then we get our zygote, our diploid zygote at the end. So that's basically the follicular phase on days 1 to 13, and the ovulation phase that I just talked about is generally speaking around day 14. That's when the egg is released from the ovary, about halfway through the ovarian cycle. So, and again, like I just mentioned, this is what I just discussed here about the completion of meiosis 2 that would occur, but this only occurs if it comes in contact with a sperm. If it doesn't come in contact with a sperm, and that ootid is only viable for about 12 to 24 hours after it's released from the ovary. If it doesn't come in contact with a sperm within 12 to 24 hours heading down the oviduct, then the egg basically just, it's done. And then it'll just sort of drift away, and then it just gets kind of, broken down by the female's, the female's reproductive system, and then it's basically useless. So it's got about a 12 to 24 hour window after ovulation that egg is going to be viable. And then if the egg doesn't get fertilized, then obviously the ovarian cycle would then just continue and then go back to the follicular phase. But we will discuss what happens and how it's different when actually fertilization occurs, because what I'm discussing today is basically the ovarian cycle as it pertains to a female if she doesn't get pregnant, which is pretty much almost every ovarian cycle that a female undergoes, there is no pregnancy after every ovarian cycle. That'd be rather rough, or there are very few ovarian cycles where there's an actual pregnancy event, right, or a fertilization event. So what I'm going to discuss here is predicated on the fact that the egg does not become fertilized by the sperm. Okay. So now that brings us to the third phase. So the egg has been released on day 14 through ovulation. Now back in the ovary, that follicle basically erupted on day 14 and released the secondary oocyte. That follicle now converts into a structure known as the Corpus Luteum, and that triggers the last phase of the ovarian cycle, which is the Luteal Phase. And it occurs from days 15 to day 28. Now the Corpus Luteum has a really important role. And what it'll do is it will stay large initially, and then as it goes through from day 15 down to day 28, the Corpus Luteum begins to disintegrate. It gets smaller and smaller and smaller as we get closer to the end of the ovarian cycle. But while it's large in size, it's going to release two huge hormones. It's going to release tons of progesterone, and it's by far the most dominant hormone in play during the luteal phase. And it also releases, some good amounts of estrogen as well. So during the luteal phase, estrogen and progesterone are the two dominant hormones. So just to kind of recap, the follicular phase were dominated by initially FSH, and then a little bit of estrogen later into that 13-day period. Ovulation is triggered by a huge increase of LH and an increase of FSH as well. That there's a bit of a decrease in FSH in the later half of the second half of the follicular phase, which I'll get to here in a couple minutes, and then it sort of spikes again at ovulation. And then the luteal phase is dominated by the release of progesterone and estrogen, which are both being released by the corpus luteum. Now, the corpus luteum, eventually, if there's no pregnancy that occurs or if there's no fertilization that occurs, then the corpus luteum will begin to disintegrate or degenerate by the end of the 28-day period. And as it gets smaller, it can only produce smaller and smaller amounts of estrogen and progesterone. And when those levels drop off significantly enough, that at the end of the 28-day cycle will then trigger menstruation to occur again on day 1, which was part of the uterine cycle. So even though it's occurring in the ovary, those hormones are basically calling the shots for the uterus at this point as well. And I'll get to that a little bit more in detail when I get to the uterus here in a couple of seconds. If you want to see it, take a look right here. Here's the ovarian cycle before I go through the roller coaster ride that is the hormonal levels during the ovarian cycle and the menstrual cycle. But watch this video if you want to see a little bit about the ovarian cycle. Okay, this diagram here, huge. This one, the government you're almost guaranteed to see a question like this on a diploma exam. You're certainly going to see a question like this on one of my quizzes or one of my exams. The government and we both expect you to basically know what the hormones are doing at given stages of the menstrual cycle. Now, what this is showing is, and I've got the diagram down here as well, but you're seeing the overlay of all the 4 major hormones that are at play during the menstrual cycle. We've got FSH, LH, estrogen, and progesterone, and what's happening to each one of them during this, and what's happening in the ovary. So here you can see the development of the follicle. You can see ovulation right there, and then you can see the formation of the corpus luteum, and then the disintegration of the corpus luteum at the end. And you can see all the corresponding hormonal levels that are occurring. So let me quickly go through it just so that everyone's kind of aware of what's going on. The first one we're going to discuss is going to be FSH, which is the one in black here on my graph. FSH levels are going to increase because the AMP pick kicks in. What happens is our estrogen levels are low on day 1. So the estrogen levels being low, that's going to have a positive, and so is progesterone, by the way. So both those hormones being at very low levels is going to cause a positive feedback loop on GnRH, which is going to release some good amounts of FSH to start off with. FSH levels are going to increase, and then what that's going to do is it's going to trigger a few days after, estrogen levels begin to increase as well. But a weird thing happens. At a certain point, the estrogen levels get so high, because normally if estrogen levels are high, we've talked about this, that estrogen has a negative impact on FSH. And at a certain point when the estrogen levels get high enough, something weird happens. And scientists can't explain this. I have tried to research why this occurs. No one really has an answer for this. It's one of the mysteries of the female body. But what happens is if the estrogen levels get significantly high enough, the estrogen will have a positive impact on GnRH and the release of FSH and LH. So what happens is my estrogen levels sort of kind of begin to increase by about day 12, day 11, day 12, and they initially have a negative impact on FSH, but at a certain point around day 12 or 13, those estrogen levels get high enough that it causes both LH and FSH levels to spike. And when that spike occurs, and there's a very distinctive spike there in the middle of the graph, you can see it over here, that spike is in correlation with ovulation. So it's ovulation that gets triggered by a massive spike in LH and a spike in FSH. Now, if you had to identify them on a graph, well, LH you can see is pretty easy. It's flatline and it only spikes once. It spikes at ovulation. Other than that, it's a flat line. FSH increases a bit during the follicular phase, spikes at ovulation, and then flat lines again during the last phase, which is the luteal phase. Progesterone is easy to spot as well. It flatlines. It has really no impact at all at the beginning of the ovarian cycle. It only kicks in once the corpus luteum forms, and then it spikes very heavily during the luteal phase, and then as the corpus luteum disintegrates, the progesterone levels decrease rapidly, which leaves us with the last one, which is estrogen. Estrogen is sort of the roller coaster ride. It goes up and down several times throughout, but you should be able to identify each of those lines in a graph and tell me which one is which and when these hormones are spiking, right? Progesterone levels spike most heavily during the luteal phase. LH levels spike the highest during ovulation. FSH levels spike once during the follicular phase and then spike again even quicker during the ovulation. And then the estrogen levels are sort of up and down, but are at their highest levels during ovulation, and they have fairly high levels in the middle of both the follicular and as well during the luteal phases. It's a graph, and it's kind of a messy one, but it's one that, in theory, you should be getting yourself familiar with. Okay, so that's the ovarian cycle. At the same time that all of this is happening, the uterus is doing stuff as well. The uterus isn't just sitting back and waiting for stuff to happen. It's got stuff going on in its neck of the woods as well. And what happens in the uterus is sort of kind of timed to do what it does because of what's happening in the ovaries. So for example, I mentioned that at the very beginning of the menstrual cycle, day 1, and that's day 1 for both the uterine and the ovarian cycle, day 1 is when menstruation begins. But of course, menstruation occurs in the uterus because it's the endometrium, the innermost lining of the uterus, that gets expelled. By day 6, the endometrial lining begins to thicken again. And the reason why that happens is it corresponds with that spike in estrogen level. Remember back on this slide here, I said to you that by about halfway through, right here we are, about day 6, take a look. My estrogen levels are beginning to peak at day 6. The reason why the endometrium begins to thicken is because my estrogen levels have increased. Estrogen, as well as progesterone, keep the endometrium in place in the uterus. In fact, it causes the endometrial lining to thicken. The higher my levels of progesterone and estrogen are, the thicker the endometrial lining will thicken up. And that's really important because we know that estrogen and progesterone thicken the most during the luteal phase, during the second half of the ovarian cycle, which is after ovulation, day 15 to 23. Well, guess what happens? It really thickens after ovulation. Now that's really important because we want the uterus to be ready a week after ovulation. If the secondary oocyte comes in contact with the sperm, it gets fertilized, it's a viable zygote, begins to divide into an embryo. That embryo is going to implant in the uterus at roughly day 21 of the cycle. So we have to make sure the endometrium is ready to receive that embryo at day 21. So that's why the uterus thickens up the fastest and the hardest right around 1 week after ovulation, which is roughly day 21 of the cycle. Between day 15 to day 23 is when it really thickens up. And that corresponds to the fact that the corpus luteum is producing large amounts of progesterone and estrogen. That's what's driving the uterus to produce all that endometrial lining. However, if there is no fertilization event that occurs, the corpus luteum in the ovary begins to degenerate, as I mentioned. It's going to produce less and less progesterone and estrogen, and that is going to basically cause the creation of the endometrial lining will then be shed. Once my progesterone and estrogen levels basically crater back here on day one, that's the trigger for essentially for menstruation to occur. The uterine lining will be shed. The whole process starts over again in both the uterus and the ovary at that point. Now, how do we prevent this from happening? You'll have to wait and see. What if the embryo is, fertilized and there's a little embryo down there? Why do females, when that happens, why do they miss a period? Why do they miss, they're late? We'll explain that when we get to prenatal development, but the embryo fights back. It actually takes control of the female's body and tells it, hey, you know what? I don't want you to shed the endometrial lining. And it basically begins to call the shots. And I will get to that in a later video later in this unit. Okay, that's it. Quick recap right over here. Watch that to kind of go over the entire, cycle that I just discussed, see how that plays out for you. And I'll be right back to finish up some stuff on my end. Hey, I got the last slide up already. Great for me. Here's that same that slide again, or that graph that I showed you earlier. This is going to show you the levels of FSH, LH, estrogen, and progesterone, and what's going on in both the uterus. It's going to show you what's going to happen in the uterus and the ovary. So this is a great little thing, showing you the relative thickness of the endometrial lining, showing you what's happening with either the follicle or the corpus luteum inside the ovary. This is a great overlap that shows you sort of all the processes, the two different cycles that are kind of coming together to create that one 28-day menstrual cycle. If you want to see your feedback loops, really intricate, but here's all the feedback loops if you want to see them and how they play out, with GnRH and FSH and LH and progesterone and estrogen. All of that stuff is there just for your entertainment if you feel like I didn't give you enough in the video today. A couple more things before we're done, and then we're finished. PMS, Premenstrual Syndrome. Some women are affected more than others. You got to remember that this is occurring right before menstruation. What happens right before menstruation on day 25 to 28? You're getting progesterone levels that are up here, estrogen levels that are up here, and then all of a sudden we're going to do this to the lady. We're going to crater them. It's like taking away someone's coffee in the morning. You have 3 cups of coffee every morning or 2 cups of coffee in the morning. Now all of a sudden you get no coffee. You're going to be a little grumpy, right? Some ladies, when you get this issue with the hormonal drop, they get irritable. There's all sorts of side effects that can occur. It varies from female to female. But yes, it is a thing. It's not some made-up situation. This is a true thing that occurs with women. PMS is a real thing. Symptoms include things like headaches, acne, tender breasts, bloating, feeling tired, irritability, mood changes. It affects every female differently, but generally it will occur just before menstruation, hence the name premenstrual syndrome. Usually occurs around the end of the ovarian and the uterine cycle, or just before the day one turnaround starts up again. And then there's menopause. Menopause occurs with every female. Eventually the female's reproductive system, the production of eggs will begin to shut down. When the end of the menstrual cycle basically occurs later in a female's life as they get older, this is known as menopause. Side effects include the very famous what are called hot flashes. Blood vessels will alternately constrict and dilate, causing the female to become hot and cold, very much out of their control. Joint and back pain can be also symptoms. Night sweats, decrease in bone mass, itching, blood cholesterol levels can rise. The vagina can become dry, prone to infection, and there can also be increased urination frequency, how quickly the female has to urinate. These could be all symptoms that occur when that happens. And again, this occurs in relation to when the ovaries stop kind of functioning around age 50, and they're in that ballpark, you get drops in estrogen and progesterone levels that are going to kind of trigger the shutdown of the entire system. Some women that to alleviate these symptoms, or some women that are not even menopausal, they could be younger. Some women undergo what is called hormone replacement therapy. This can be used to can be used to ease the symptoms of menopause. So they inject themselves with amounts of estrogen and progesterone to kind of alleviate the side effects as the body begins to shut down its reproductive system. That's it. That's the female reproductive system in a nutshell. Here's your recap video from Crash Course. Give it a watch. Hank will walk you through the entire female reproductive system. He always does a great job, great animations, and please, I encourage you to, if you're going to watch any video today, this is the one to watch. For homework, there's a question booklet. It's going to be the Female Reproductive System question book, how aptly named. That is what you have to complete in relation to this lesson and the notes that are with it. Join me next time. We are going to be discussing arts and contraception. See you then.